From Melrose Arts, this is Art in Action, a series of live art demonstrations by prominent local artists. Working before an audience, the artists describe their process and answer questions about their technique. They show you their approach to art in a very personal way. From the art of encaustic, reverse painting on glass, fiber art, and calligraphy, it's all here. Sponsored by Melrose Arts, a volunteer group dedicated to encouraging the visual arts in Melrose. These monthly art demos are open to the public and free of charge. Today on Art in Action, landscape painter Whitney Heavey shows us how to paint a gestural and loose interpretation of an ocean wave using oils. Whitney's paintings are a celebration of the ever-changing colors in the New England landscape. Using the framework of a landscape composition, she strives to paint with a rhythm which results in layers of color until the surface has a buzz that makes the landscape come alive.
I think I'll just start painting, if you don't mind. So I like to think about all the rules of painting, but I tend to be more intuitive with how I paint and try to just do it fast and then hone in on where I'm going. So I'm just mixing up a little ultramarine and phthalo. And I do tend to use a lot of pure colors. Although I've been trying to broaden my range of grays because I know they can be very useful. So I'm just gonna try to be somewhat fast. And I always start with a really loose underpainting. I don't usually grid my work. I typically would try to paint things in their complementary colors. I tried to get out of that mindset of, oh, I'm painting a green tree, there's the green. So I always try to go, okay, well, it's a bluish green, so I'm gonna make it sort of orangish red, and sometimes it was an underpainting, sometimes it stayed those colors, but I tried to get out of that sort of what colors are in our head as the definition. What I've learned about painting waves is that there's all these thoughts of the rules and the horizon when it goes back. I was definitely trained as a landscape painter, and the horizon when it goes back, it gets grayer and this and that. And what I've learned is I spent a lot of time just sitting and watching waves, is that you can always find exceptions to the rules. So I try to not get too hung up on that. If I find a painting's not working for me, then I might go, okay, well, what's going on with this, the value, or the temperatures, and so that can be helpful. But I try not to overthink it initially. I used to always paint on canvas, but in recent years I switched to these cradled gesso boards, and they're like that, and they're bare wood on the sides and they're gessoed on the front, and I really like them. I like them that I can scrape, I can sand away, paint if things aren't going well or the texture's not to my liking, and sometimes interesting things come to the surface, and I work with that. I think one thing that some people find when they first work on these boards is that they're so smooth, it can be a little bit of a shock. The canvas can just have a little tooth at first. So I try to work all over the surface and not stay in one place. I often wonder if I need to be more consistent, because I try not to have a real formula to my paintings. I try just to paint. I'll paint these waves on paper, and I'll do all sorts of things, like I'll even do it here even though it's not paper, but I use it sometimes here. I save all those old, like, junky fake credit cards you get in the mail, and I might spread some, this one's a little gouged, spread some paint. So I did that a lot on the paper, and I just really tried to have fun. In fact, my favorite part of painting is the beginning. It's only at the end where I start getting really stressed out. And, you know, I just try not to cover up the looseness or the stuff I enjoy the most. So I've done a lot of very detail-oriented tight paintings of fish in particular and watercolors, and I can do them, but I don't enjoy the process as much. So I think the nice challenge, I used to always paint with all these really loud colors, a lot of reds and bold colors, but really the thing that has always inspired me the most has been the ocean. But what I found was that if I tried to paint just the water or the water and sky, it's so simple, such a simple composition that it was really hard to do anything interesting with it. A couple of years ago, I took a workshop with a teacher, and I really started exploring sort of things you can do with the paint and surface, and I did a lot of paintings, just simple water, sky, and it really forced me to say, okay, here's blue and blue. How am I going to make it interesting, and to look at a few of the more fine details. I do things that make me happy. And sometimes I find just at the beginning, the palette knife can be useful just to get the paint on the surface. Because like I said, this can be kind of a slippery surface. So until you start getting a buildup of some of the paint, it can kind of move around a lot. I will say, you know, I try to keep in mind the fat over lean when you're starting a painting, and you want to have it leaner, more turpentine or solvent, and less of the fats. But I try not to get too hung up in it. And I try to be aware of if I'm using my arm all in one direction. You know, sometimes someone said to me once, you can always tell, and I think I had done a painting and it stuck with me, when an artist is right-handed, and it's a good idea to once in a while to throw in a paint stroke with your other arm, or if you're doing a landscape where you're doing all motions that are horizontal, to once in a while do some vertical. I think I want to try to get some of the greens in there. Actually, I'll probably start with some yellow and build up to the greens. And unfortunately, the light on this day, it was very, you know, midday, very intense, but not a dramatic lighting. So some of my light on my whites are lost a bit in this photo. So I have to improvise a bit. I try to really look at the waves and the air, and I loved reading about Turner and how he sort of said he doesn't like to paint what a landscape or what the environment looks like, but how it feels to be in that environment. And I know that's sort of what I try to go for. So I've been doing these waves, but as you know, there's no structure. I mean, there is a structure, there's a force of the water and the movement, but there's no hard structure other than the ocean floor. So that's always the challenge. So at a certain point, I start looking and going, all right, this shape got really wide here, and it really is more of a fan. I don't paint with black. I think that goes from, I don't know, some teacher somewhere along the line. In fact, I often don't even paint. I think yellow ochre is about the most sort of brown I get. I'm trying to sort of look at the shadows. I'm noticing that some of the shadows in this wave, which will be coming out from the white, sort of at the bottom, have a grayer, sort of a more lavender or ultramarine base, and the sort of the top edge has a little more of a greenish grayish cast. I also have this book that I keep in my studio or with me, and it's actually got two sides, although I need a new one. And I try to just put a lot of inspiration in here, colors, palettes. I mean, sometimes I get inspired by, I mean, this is some sort of image of a gem, but I really like the different blues in there. Because we all get to our studio where it's like, oh, same old, same old. I try to go out and see art, try to get into the MFA or the ICA pretty regularly. These are some photos I've taken. Actually, that's that one. I was working in squares mostly until recently. I don't know, all of a sudden I'm craving rectangles, so I'm gonna go with it. I try to paint even if I'm not feeling it, if I'm not in the mood, or I get to my studio. A lot of times I do. If I'm really not feeling up for painting, I'll go in and sometimes I just tidy up my studio or look through images. But I always try to get paint on the canvas. And I like to, that's why I like having a lot of paintings going, because there's always some paintings I don't care about, or they haven't gotten too important, and I can just paint on them and play. And I find when I'm in that play mode, that's when I get better stuff. It's when I get really like, oh, commissions, that's the worst. It's like a guarantee for my least favorite work. No matter, I don't go into most of my paintings with an expectation. I might go into it with an idea that I want to push light. I want to try to push-pull something or work with the texture. But what I find is if I go into it with an expectation and they go into it with, how can we possibly be visualizing the same thing? So. And the challenge of this one always is sort of getting the wave, not to have it be one sort of parallel bar of color. For me, I always say I wish I had elves that would come into my studio at night and just go, okay, it's done. Because so often I take a painting that I really liked and ruin it. So I don't know if it's the light, but I'm seeing a little like some sort of warmer tones to this wave up above. And this is kind of a funky wave because it's this sort of, you know, you have this and then this little bit and then this big wave. It was a very tumultuous day with water sort of going in a lot of directions. I do love painting with the palette knife, especially when it's cleanup time. But I do find, like, when with the texture, I definitely like, I like the sort of restfulness of a brush painting. As far as the palette knife, you have to be so careful it doesn't become that sort of very loud everywhere painting. But especially for getting a painting going, you can really get the paint on fast. When I taught, I hated it when I got a student who said, "I'm not an artist, I'm horrible at it." I always just, my attitude was everyone can be a good artist. And it's just a matter of practice, and there's no right or wrong or. There's definitely rules that you can use to your advantage, but I don't think they're rules that you have to, like, adhere to necessarily. They can help you, but I've also been known to, in college I didn't paint with gloves, but just with how drying and cracked and just the paint, I've just found that it makes cleanup easier if I'm wearing gloves. But I have occasionally been known to take my gloves and start doing a little finger painting in my paintings, which actually, if you have a painting that's all of a sudden you're really not happy with, it can actually be really fun. And it kind of can create a surface, literally like this. I'll go like, and then the next time, now I have something to work with, and it can be really fun. I've used things like bubble wrap and painted on that just to get a texture going. I don't want it to look like bubble wrap in the end, but it can just, actually I didn't bring any, it can just literally get some colors in different places that when you start going back in, yeah, I'll take a piece of bubble wrap and I'll, I might take some paint and paint it, and then I might press it here and here and here, and then I start working into it, and if it's not at the end of the painting, then it's creating little, I don't know, I think it's sort of the little changes of color that make a blue ocean look interesting to me. But I don't want to, some people would want to see the bubble wrap, and that might be intentional, printmakers, or, I don't necessarily want to see that process, but I like the variety it can give to the surface. And it can also kind of take away that really precious sort of feel of your art, which is not what I'm not going for that really tight, realist look. Definitely see that I want to bring some more darks. I am trying to sort of look at the darks and lights and see where that can sort of help. And of course, my practical side would say, I just kind of grayed down this blue, and because it's in the foreground, I should probably not gray it down as much. But I'll do that later if I decide it's too gray. And I do notice there's some sort of, in this area, there's some real sort of variations between this dark blue and greens and then more greens. I do think it helps when you're painting water to recognize that so much that's in the surface of the water is a reflection of the sky. Especially, not so much this wave, but when I'm doing sort of more some of the rolling waves, you really start to see how that happens. And The nice thing about the palette knife is that you can, when your surface gets wet, the oils, sometimes if you go in with the brush, it's hard to keep the paint from getting kind of muddy or blending in. But the thing I like about the palette knife is that I can still, I can lay the color there so I can see it. I think for me, I try to keep in mind not to, sometimes when I have a color that I like and it's been mixed, it's very tempting to put it multiple. Well, I have this pile of nice blue, so I should use it, but then next thing you know, I have it in too many places and I've lost the power of it. When you have an area that you want that's going to be very light, it's going to look lighter if there's darks near it. And while there's no real dark like that up there, sometimes just like some really subtle value shifts can help sort of punch that up. That's definitely too much, but when I start laying in some of the whites on top. The nice thing about the board is you can also you can go in and do some pulling out of some shapes. If you're finding you're having a hard time sort of getting the paint, if it's getting too sort of mushy. Yeah. Maybe, and maybe because it's a firm surface, you're not afraid. I mean, I've even done, just to show you, I'm not going to do this, but sorry, is that horrible? Scratching. I've even like sort of scraped into the board for texture. I think what can be really fun is when it's dry and you sand it. Although you do have to be careful because any surface that's left can become a friend or a foe, depending on how it goes. I had one painting which was sort of this abstract dot painting, and I sanded it, and then I did this sort of hazy sort of landscape scene over it. And then I went to sand the landscape painting and the dots came through. I ended up loving it. It was very, very different for me, very, very abstract, but it had a real atmosphere going. So that was kind of one of those really fun events. All right, that's definitely too pink, and it's going to try to come in front of these things up here. Sometimes when you're working with the palette knife, like I said, the surface can get very, what I would call noisy. Going in and softening areas can help eliminate some of that visual noise. And I find it's when little things happen between little intersections or a varied edge where things happen that make it interesting. I'm actually probably one of the world's worst straight line drawers. I do try to measure out a horizon. It might not be very super straight in the end, but I try to have the sketch at least straight. And I know a lot of times looking at the horizon, there's always this like more atmosphere right at the edge, which I always find gives a little more depth. Of course, it's always a challenge when you have that little sky. Definitely want to pull in some more darks in that area. I've even been known to like take, this is just like a printmaker. If I'm doing a big painting, I might put paint along the edge and just start almost like a printmaking, just to get the paint down. I think for me, sort of working the surface, getting the paint on the canvas isn't really the problem. It's like, how do you make it sort of do what you want it to do? It's still way too light back there. I know a lot of people say, oh, you have to mix all your paints on your palette, but it is something I kind of like to do sometimes on the surface, as long as I'm not getting that. It's also kind of like frosting a cake. So if you like doing that, it kind of has the same. You know, and then I do things like I start looking at, okay, where's my horizon? Is it right in the middle of the painting? I don't want to do that. Was this space the same as this space, the same as that? You know, and if they're sometimes they become too much the same as I'm going, so then I start to go, okay, was this wave way off? I feel like this one needs a little more strength back here. So at a certain point, like I notice, I just can't seem to get this area. I want to have it darker, so I might actually wipe a little away, because whenever I put anything more there, it's just going to mix with that. What I've found is that I like painting in really hot colors, but I love being out in nature and blues and greens, so I tend to paint things that I like. So I guess that's what you should do, right? I try to squint a lot at my paintings, find that's really helpful. And I like taking my pictures of my paintings in progress, and then, you know, when I go home, looking at them, cropping them. Sometimes, you know, you can sort of play around with the color, warm it up, or play with the contrast, and it's not that I would then go copy what I did, but it might give me some inspiration of some things to try. I also find it can be helpful to turn my painting upside down and work on. Sometimes I'm a little more allowing of drips. Like I said, I don't really tend to stay very consistent as far as my methods. I guess I try to be open to where the painting's going and what's inspired me. I have to just put a little more white over there. And the white, especially in the waves, when I go back in, punching those whites up when it's not wet, that's when I'll get that real pop. Thank you.
Whitney Heavey has shown us how to start an oil painting of an ocean wave. Working from one of her photos, Whitney lays down a loose and expressive layer of oil paint on a cradled board that has been primed with gesso. Whitney uses a mixture of tools, including brushes and palette knives, to create an active surface. Be sure to check Whitney's website, whitneyheavey.com, for further examples of her fine work and to learn of upcoming shows and classes. Visit melrosearts.com for information about Melrose Arts, upcoming events, and future Art in Action demonstrations. Melrose Arts, dedicated to encouraging the visual arts in Melrose.